In 1996, Claire Robinson, a newly certified nurse, took her first job at an old hospital in rural Pennsylvania. The building was built in the 1930s and was known for its outdated facilities and eerie atmosphere. Claire was assigned to the night shift, quiet, monotonous, and perfect for gaining experience, or so she thought. One stormy night, the power flickered on and off as Claire made her rounds. Most of the patients were asleep, except for one, a man in room 108. His chart had no name, just John Doe. He had been admitted after being found unconscious at the edge of the woods, and he hadn't woken up since. Claire had avoided the room since starting her shift. Something about it made her skin crawl. The air inside was colder than the rest of the hospital, and the man's presence felt wrong. But duty called. She stepped into room 108 and checked his vitals. Everything was normal, yet as she adjusted the fourth, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. She glanced up and saw his eyes wide open, staring at her. "Mr. Doe?" Claire whispered, startled. The man didn't respond. His lips were cracked, his skin pale. But those eyes, they were glassy and unblinking, as though he were looking through her. Suddenly, the monitor flatlined. Claire grabbed the emergency button and called for help. But as she turned back to him, the man's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was ice cold. "They're coming for you," he rasped, his voice hollow and guttural. Claire screamed and pulled away, stumbling out of the room. By the time other nurses arrived, the man was dead. The coroner's report later stated that the man had died hours before Claire's encounter. "Impossible," Claire insisted, recounting how he had spoken to her. But the security footage showed her standing alone in the room, speaking to no one. Claire quit her job a week later. She never returned to nursing, haunted by the man's final words and the ghostly grip that left bruises on her wrist, bruises she carried for years. Room 108 was sealed off soon after. Staff claimed to hear whispers and see shadows moving inside. To this day, no one knows who John Doe was or why he appeared that night.
On a cold, foggy October evening, Mia was helping her grandmother clean out the attic. In the corner, hidden beneath a dusty old sheet, she found an antique mirror. Its golden frame was etched with strange, twisted symbols that seemed to shimmer under the dim light. "This used to belong to my sister," her grandmother said with a shaky voice. "She didn't like it much." Mia felt a chill run down her spine but shrugged it off. Intrigued, she brought the mirror to her room, thinking it would be a unique decoration. That night, as Mia lay in bed scrolling on her phone, she noticed something odd. In the moonlight, her reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. The room was still, but her reflection twitched ever so slightly. She blinked. Her reflection didn't. Mia gasped and turned on the bedside lamp. The reflection moved normally again, but the air in the room felt heavy. She dismissed it as tiredness and pulled the covers over her head. At midnight, Mia woke to a soft scratching sound. She sat up, her heart pounding. The noise was coming from the mirror. "Just the house settling," she whispered to herself. But then she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Mia, look closer." Her blood froze. The whisper wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the mirror. Summoning all her courage, she stepped closer and peered into the glass. At first, all she saw was her pale reflection. But then, a shadowy figure appeared behind her. Its face was obscured, but its glowing, hollow eyes burned into hers. She spun around. The room was empty. The next morning, Mia told her best friend, Lily, about the strange events. "Burn the mirror," Lily said immediately. "That's not something you mess with." Mia laughed nervously. "It's just an old mirror." Maybe I imagined it. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. That evening, she tried to ignore the mirror. She covered it with a blanket and focused on her homework. But as she turned off her light to sleep, she saw something horrifying. The blanket over the mirror moved, as if something underneath was trying to push its way out. Her chest tightened. She didn't dare move. The blanket fell to the floor on its own, revealing the mirror. There, etched into the glass, were the words, "You can't hide." Mia confronted her grandmother the next day. "What's wrong with the mirror?" she demanded. Her grandmother hesitated, then sighed. "That mirror belonged to my sister Evelyn. She always said it showed her things, terrible things. She tried to get rid of it, but it always came back." "What happened to Evelyn?" Mia asked. Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. "One night, we heard her screaming. When we rushed in, she was gone. The only thing left was the mirror. We never found her." Mia's heart pounded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think it would awaken again," her grandmother said weakly. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. The mirror loomed in the darkness like a hungry beast. The whispers started again, louder this time. "Mia, let me out." Shaking, Mia approached the mirror. The shadow was there, clearer than before. It wasn't just a figure now. It had a face, twisted and grotesque, with a wide, gaping mouth that stretched too far. "Release me," it growled. "What do you want?" Mia cried. The mirror rattled violently, and the shadow pressed its hands against the glass as if trying to break through. Cracks began to spread across the surface. Suddenly, a freezing wind swept through the room, and the lights flickered. The shadow screamed, a sound that pierced Mia's ears. Then everything went silent. Mia decided to destroy the mirror. She grabbed a hammer and struck it with all her strength. The glass shattered into countless shards. But as the pieces fell, something dark spilled out. Thick, black smoke that filled the room. From the smoke emerged a figure, tall and skeletal, with glowing red eyes and long, clawed fingers. "You freed me," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. Mia tried to run, but the figure was faster. It grabbed her arm with an icy grip. "You took my place," it whispered. The next morning, Mia's grandmother found her room empty. The mirror was whole again, sitting silently against the wall. When she looked into it, she screamed. Inside the glass, Mia's terrified face stared back, banging on the other side of the mirror, her mouth open in a silent scream. From the reflection, the shadow smiled. It had found a new home.
It was late at night, and Maya was at the train station. She had missed the last regular train and was waiting for the midnight train. The platform was empty, except for a flickering streetlight and the sound of the wind. Suddenly, an announcement crackled over the speakers. "The midnight train is arriving. Please step back from the platform." Maya shivered. The voice sounded strange almost, hollow. She looked down the tracks and saw the train approaching. Its headlights barely lit the tracks ahead, and it moved silently without the usual screech of wheels. As the train stopped, its doors opened with a soft hiss. Maya hesitated but stepped inside. The train car was dimly lit, and the air felt cold. She noticed the passengers. They were all silent, sitting perfectly still and dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Maya sat in the corner and tried not to look at them. She whispered to herself, "Just a train ride home. Nothing to worry about." The train started moving, but instead of speeding up, it crept forward slowly. Maya glanced at the window. The outside world was pitch black, as if the train wasn't moving through a city but a void. Suddenly, Maya heard faint whispers. She looked around, but the passengers remained silent, their faces hidden in shadows. The whispers grew louder, and she realized they were coming from behind her seat. "Help us! Save us!" Maya turned around, but no one was there. Her heart pounded. She stood up and walked toward the next car, hoping to find the conductor or someone who could explain what was happening. The next car was empty, except for the conductor. He stood at the far end, his back to her. Maya called out, "Excuse me, what's going on? Where is this train going?" The conductor turned slowly. His face was pale, and his eyes were hollow, glowing faintly in the dark. He spoke in a voice that made Maya's blood run cold. "This train doesn't go home. It collects lost souls." Maya stepped back, her breath quickening. "I'm not supposed to be here," she shouted. The conductor tilted his head. "Are you sure?" he asked. He pointed at a seat near the window. There was a photograph lying there. Maya picked it up and froze. It was a picture of her, taken that very night, standing on the platform. Maya's mind raced. "No, this can't be real," she whispered. The whispers returned, louder this time. "You were warned. You didn't listen. Stay with us." She remembered crossing the tracks earlier that night, rushing to catch the train. She hadn't seen the lights, hadn't heard the horn. Tears filled her eyes as she looked back at the conductor. He nodded solemnly. "This is the last train for the lost. Welcome aboard." Maya tried to scream, but no sound came out. The train continued into the darkness, and the passengers turned to look at her for the first time. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, just like the conductor's. The whispers surrounded her. "Now, you're one of us." The train vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind. Moral of the story: some chances are one time, and some warnings shouldn't be ignored. Pine Hollow had always been a quiet town, tucked away in the hills, surrounded by dense forests and rolling mist. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were rare, and life unfolded in a predictable rhythm. But for the last 2 months, something had changed. It started with one missing person. Mary Thompson, a school teacher, vanished without a trace. At first, it was shrugged off as a disappearance. Maybe she'd left for a new life, or perhaps it was some sort of accident. But then, one by one, the wives of Pine Hollow began to disappear. Annabelle, the baker's wife Clara, the doctor's wife Elizabeth, who ran the local store. They were all gone, without a single clue, without a sound. The husbands were frantic, each of them trying to make sense of what was happening. The town sheriff, Henry Calloway, launched investigation after investigation, but nothing came up. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no trace of any kind. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The only common thread? All the missing women were married. As the weeks passed, the town grew more and more unsettled. People began to whisper about the disappearances, some of them speculating that there was something sinister behind it, but no one dared to voice their thoughts too loudly. One evening, after yet another fruitless search, Sheriff Calloway sat alone in his office, running over the same evidence in his head. He had interviewed every husband, every neighbor, every friend, but still, there was nothing. It was as if the women had just disappeared from existence. His mind wandered, and then it hit him. There was one person he hadn't questioned. The one person who seemed too calm in the face of so much chaos. Arthur Green. Green was new to town, having moved there just before the first disappearance. He was a quiet man, a writer, who lived on the outskirts of town. And strangely, he was never seen with his wife, Margaret. The few times the two had been seen together, there was an odd tension, a coldness between them that no one could explain. Sheriff Calloway decided to pay Arthur a visit. He drove down the winding road that led to Green's secluded house, the headlights of his car cutting through the thick fog that seemed to always cling to the land. As he arrived at the house, he noticed something strange. There were no lights on, no signs of life at all. It was eerily quiet. The door creaked open with a single push, as if it had been waiting for him. Inside, the house was dark, with only the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the windows. There was an odd, pungent smell in the air, something that reminded Calloway of old paper and something more, something wrong. He made his way through the hallway and into the living room. The air was thick with dust, but there, in the corner of the room, was a large bookshelf. Calloway walked toward it, drawn to it inexplicably. He reached out and pulled the nearest book from the shelf. It fell open in his hands, but it wasn't a regular book. It was a journal, its pages filled with strange, cryptic writing, almost as if written in a hurry. Some of the entries were dated, others were not, but one thing was clear. The writing was about the women of Pine Hollow. The pages told a chilling tale. Arthur Green had been a part of a long-forgotten ritual, one that promised to keep his wife forever young, forever his. The ritual, however, required a sacrifice, a soul, and the women of Pine Hollow were chosen. He had taken them one by one, using their love for their husbands to bind them to him. Each woman, it seemed, had been brought to this house, never to return. Their lives were the price to ensure that his own life, his own marriage, remained undisturbed. As Calloway read, he felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The last entry was dated just a few days ago. The final one will be soon. Once she is mine, I will be free from this curse. Margaret will be mine again, and I will live forever. Before Calloway could comprehend the gravity of what he was reading, he heard a noise behind him, the creaking of footsteps. Slowly, he turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Arthur Green. But his eyes, they were not the eyes of the man Calloway had seen around town. They were empty, hollow, as though all warmth and life had been drained from them. "You shouldn't have come here, Sheriff," Green said, his voice cold and detached. Calloway's hand instinctively reached for his gun, but it was too late. Green stepped forward, and with each step the air grew heavier, suffocating, as if the very house itself was alive, aware and hungry. A sudden realization hit Calloway. He wasn't just facing a man. He was facing something ancient, something evil. Green had never been human. He was something else. Something that had been hiding in plain sight, feeding off the love and lives of those around him. With one final step, Green lunged at the sheriff, his hand gripping Calloway's throat with an unnatural strength. In his last moments, Calloway's eyes widened as he saw, just behind Green, a pale, lifeless figure. Margaret. She stood silently, watching her husband's work unfold. The next morning, the entire town of Pine Hollow woke to the news. Sheriff Calloway was missing, and the women, they were gone, as if they had never existed. The only trace left behind was the haunting journal, found lying open on the floor, the last entry still visible. "Once she is mine, I will live forever." Pine Hollow was never the same. The men who had once searched for their wives, desperate and broken, now went about their lives as if nothing had changed. The wives had never truly existed, and neither did the search for them. The town had fallen under an unspoken spell, and life in Pine Hollow went on, forever changed, forever dark. And in the shadows of the house on the hill, Arthur Green smiled, his marriage complete once again. In 1959, a group of 9 seasoned hikers, led by Igor Dyatlov, embarked on a journey into the frigid wilderness of the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. They aimed to reach Odorten, a peak whose name ominously translates to "don't go there." Unfazed by folklore and warnings, they pushed forward, confident in their skills. Days into the expedition, they set up camp on a desolate slope of Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain. Snowfall was relentless, blanketing their tents and muffling the world in silence. That night, something happened, something that defied logic and left investigators and families haunted for decades. The search party found their campsite weeks later. It was chaos frozen in time. Their tent was shredded, ripped open from the inside, as though the hikers had fled in blind terror. Tracks led downhill, barefoot, despite the freezing temperatures. The first bodies were found near a tree, stripped to their underwear, with frozen fingers clawing at the bark. It was as though they had tried to climb the tree to escape something. Others were discovered in a ravine, further from the campsite. Their injuries were inexplicable. One had a fractured skull, two had crushed ribs, and one woman was missing her tongue. There were no external wounds to explain the internal trauma, and no tracks to suggest an attacker. Decades later, a journalist named Anya became obsessed with uncovering the truth. She retraced the hikers' steps, determined to solve the enigma that had eluded explanation. She carried an old journal belonging to one of the hikers, found at the site but never deciphered. The journal's last entry was chilling. "There is something watching us. It doesn't belong here." Anya camped at the same site on the 60th anniversary of the hikers' disappearance. As night fell, she felt the same oppressive silence the group must have experienced. The wind whispered through the trees like voices, but there was no one else for miles. At midnight, Anya woke to a sound. Footsteps, crunching in the snow, circled her tent. She froze, heart pounding, every nerve screaming at her to flee. Then, a shadow passed across the thin fabric of the tent. It wasn't human. She forced herself to peek outside, holding a flashlight with trembling hands. The beam illuminated nothing but snow and darkness. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder and more erratic. She ran, abandoning her gear, sprinting blindly into the night, just as the hikers had. She stumbled upon the ravine where some of their bodies were found. Her flashlight flickered, and in that moment she saw them, 9 figures standing in the snow, staring at her. Their eyes glowed, their mouths hung open, but no sound came out. The last thing she remembered was falling, the cold seeping into her bones, and a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Anya was found days later, wandering the forest, incoherent and frostbitten. She never spoke of what happened, but her camera contained a single photo, a blurred figure, impossibly tall, with long limbs and empty eyes, looming in the snow. To this day, she refuses to discuss what she saw, but locals claim they hear screams echoing from Dead Mountain on cold winter nights, a warning to those who dare to disturb what should be left alone. Emily was a curious, adventurous little girl, always asking questions and looking for new things to discover. Her favorite thing in the world was playing with toys. She had a small collection of stuffed animals, dolls, and other trinkets scattered around her room. But one rainy afternoon, her grandmother gave her something she'd never seen before, a beautiful porcelain doll. It had pale skin, dark eyes, and golden hair that shimmered in the light, styled in delicate curls. Its dress was made of fine lace and deep blue fabric, and its face was painted with the most lifelike smile Emily had ever seen. It seemed to be smiling only at her, as if it had been waiting for her to come. "This is a very special doll," her grandmother whispered as she handed it to Emily. "But remember, you must never take it outside your room, and you must never look into its eyes at night. Promise me, Emily." Emily nodded eagerly, not fully understanding why her grandmother seemed so serious. "I promise, Grandma," she said, hugging the doll tightly. But her grandmother's eyes were filled with something deeper, concern perhaps, or fear. After the gift was handed over, her grandmother kissed her on the forehead and left the room. That night, after Emily's mother tucked her in, she placed the doll gently on the shelf by her bed. The rain tapped softly against the window, and a gentle breeze rustled the curtains. Emily tried to sleep, but the house seemed quieter than usual. As the night grew darker, she began hearing strange noises. At first, it was a soft creaking sound from the corner of her room, where the doll sat. But soon the creaking grew louder, like something moving, something scratching at the walls. Emily's heart began to race. She pulled the blanket tightly over her head, trying to block out the noise, but the scratching persisted, now accompanied by soft whispers. "Emily, come closer." Emily's eyes shot open. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was calling her name, soft and pleading. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind or the house settling, but the whispers only grew louder. "Please, come, play with me." Unable to ignore the voice, Emily sat up in bed, The room was pitch dark, except for the dim moonlight streaming through the window. She glanced at the shelf where the doll was. To her horror, the doll's eyes were no longer the soft brown they had been before. It was as though they were glowing, a deep red hue that sent a shiver down her spine. She froze, unable to move or speak. The doll's smile, once sweet, seemed to stretch unnaturally, widening into something far more sinister. The whispers continued, now more desperate, as if something or someone was waiting. Emily, look at me, closer. With her heart pounding in her chest, Emily stood up, her legs shaking. She felt as though something was pulling her toward the doll, like an invisible force dragging her closer. As her fingers reached for it, the doll's head tilted slightly to the side, its black eyes fixed on her, never blinking. The whispers were now louder, almost as if the doll was speaking directly into her mind. You belong to me now, the voice hissed. Emily's hand jerked back in fear, but the doll's eyes glowed even brighter, its smile widening impossibly. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The room seemed to grow colder with each passing second, and the shadows on the walls stretched toward her like reaching hands. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the eerie glow of the doll's eyes. In that moment, Emily realized that the whispers weren't coming from the doll alone. They surrounded her, coming from every corner of the room, from the walls, from the very air she breathed. You must obey me, Emily, the voice crooned. Emily tried to turn and run, but her legs felt like lead. The floor beneath her seemed to shift, and the shadows began to close in on her. She fought against the pull, trying to escape, but the whispers grew more frantic. Come back, Emily. You cannot leave. You are mine forever. The shadows crept up around her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, pulling her closer to the doll. Panic surged through her as the room seemed to spin. She wanted to scream, to call out for her mother, but no words came. Her mind screamed for help, but her body betrayed her. Suddenly, everything went silent. The air grew thick, and the shadows seemed to pause, waiting. Emily dared not look at the doll again, but she could feel its presence, its watchful eyes upon her. Just as Emily thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the door to her room creaked open. Her grandmother's voice called out from the hallway, trembling and urgent. Emily, don't look into its eyes. The old woman rushed into the room, her hands shaking as she grabbed the doll from the shelf and threw it onto the floor. The doll's eyes, which had been glowing red, instantly darkened and returned to their normal porcelain color. The room seemed to relax, the oppressive feeling lifting as if something dark had been pushed back. But it was too late. Emily was frozen in fear, her body stiff as a board. Her grandmother pulled her into her arms, whispering frantic words of comfort, but Emily couldn't understand them. Her gaze remained fixed on the doll, its innocent smile now twisted and knowing. Her grandmother hurriedly removed the doll from the room, locking it away in the attic. The strange feeling that had gripped the house seemed to lift with its removal, but Emily knew something had changed. The next morning, Emily's mother was frantic. She had come to check on her daughter, but when she entered the room, there was no sign of Emily. The bed was untouched, and the doll was gone. Her mother called Emily's name, but there was no answer. She searched the house, calling out, but found no trace of her. Her grandmother, too, seemed strangely distant, unable to explain what had happened. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. Days passed, but Emily never returned. The police were called, and an investigation began. No one could explain her disappearance, and the only clue they found was a single porcelain teardrop, left on the floor beside the shelf where the doll had once sat. Several months later, Emily's mother, desperate to find answers, returned to the house one stormy night. She felt she needed to know the truth, to find closure. Her grandmother's warnings still haunted her, never look into its eyes at night. With trembling hands, Emily's mother climbed to the attic and found the cursed doll lying there, untouched. But when she reached for it, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The doll's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, those same dark red eyes that Emily had seen. Just as she touched it, a whisper filled the room. "She's with me now, forever." Emily's mother turned in horror, her eyes scanning the room. But there was nothing. Then, in the reflection of the attic mirror, she saw her daughter, pale, lifeless, with the same glowing red eyes. Emily's smile stretched wide, no longer innocent but full of knowing darkness. "You shouldn't have come back," the ghostly version of Emily whispered, her voice as cold as ice. The doll had claimed its next victim. Nurse, Carla, joined St. Gabriel's Hospital, a century-old facility known for its sprawling corridors and outdated architecture. On her first night shift, the head nurse handed her an unusual task: take inventory of Ward 9. Carla hesitated. She hadn't seen Ward 9 during orientation. "Don't worry," the head nurse said with a tight smile. "Just check it off. No patients there anymore." Armed with her flashlight, Carla wandered down the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoing ominously. Ward 9 was at the far end, its entrance sealed with a heavy wooden door that creaked open reluctantly. Inside, the room was stale and cold, illuminated only by her flashlight's weak beam. The ward was smaller than she expected, lined with 6 iron-framed beds covered in dusty sheets. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and mildew. Carla began jotting notes, her pen scratching against the clipboard. She examined the first bed, its sheet neatly tucked. The second bed was the same, but when she approached the third, she froze. The sheet on the third bed was crumpled, as if someone had recently lain there. She brushed it off as the janitor's oversight. But then she noticed faint indentations on the pillow. It looked fresh. Her heart quickened. A faint sound caught her attention. Not whispers or footsteps, but a soft, rhythmic thumping. It seemed to come from the farthest corner of the ward, behind a rusted curtain. She called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" She approached the curtain slowly, every nerve in her body screaming to turn back. With a trembling hand, she yanked it aside. Nothing. Just an old cabinet with broken drawers. The thumping stopped. Carla sighed in relief and continued her inventory. But the moment she moved to the fourth bed, the thumping resumed, louder, insistent. This time it was coming from beneath the floor. Carla dropped to her knees and inspected the floorboards. They were warped and uneven. Pressing her ear against the wood, she heard it clearly, a heartbeat. "No, this can't be real," she whispered, pulling herself back up. Determined to finish her task quickly, she moved to the fifth bed. The sheet had a deep, rusty stain on it. Blood? No, it had to be something else. Time had a way of turning things grotesque in such places. But as she touched the sheet, she felt it, wet, warm. She gasped, pulling her hand back, staring at the fresh crimson smearing her palm. A loud crash came from the cabinet she'd inspected earlier. She spun around, flashlight trembling. The cabinet door was ajar now. Carla swore she'd left it shut. "Hello? Whoever's here, this isn't funny." Silence enveloped the room once more. She stepped closer to the cabinet, her pulse racing. She swung the door open fully. Empty. Turning to leave, her flashlight flickered. When it came back on, she saw it. Every bed, including the ones she'd marked as untouched, now had someone lying in them. Their faces were hidden under sheets, but their forms were unmistakable. Thin, motionless bodies. Her knees buckled. She backed into the cabinet, unable to scream, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, the sheet-covered forms began to sit up, their movements jerky, unnatural. A raspy voice broke the silence. "Why did you wake us?" The flashlight flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, Carla felt an icy grip on her arm. When the light steadied, she was alone. The ward was empty. When the head nurse found Carla hours later, she was curled up in the corner, whispering incoherently. Her clipboard was gone, and etched into the floor beneath the third bed in deep gouges were the words, "We never left." Horror is often about what isn't seen, letting the unknown gnaw at the edges of reason. The Forgotten Ward keeps the terror grounded, building suspense through subtle, horrifying discoveries. Let me know if you'd like it tweaked further. There was a small, quiet village named Havenwood, surrounded by dense woods and whispering streams. Beneath the veil of serenity lay a dreadful tale that villagers dared not discuss. The story was of the Garrison House, an ancient stone manor that loomed at the edge of the woods, untouched for decades. It was said that anyone who entered its cellar never came back. Riley, a journalist with a knack for debunking urban legends, decided to uncover the truth. He dismissed the villagers' warnings as mere superstition and arrived at Garrison House on a misty evening. The air was heavy, the silence unnerving. The house creaked as he stepped inside, its walls damp and adorned with peeling wallpaper. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing cobwebbed furniture and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. But Riley wasn't here for the house. He was here for the cellar. He found the cellar door in the kitchen, secured with rusted chains and a padlock that seemed ancient. Breaking it open with a crowbar, he descended the stone steps into a dark abyss. The air grew colder with each step, and the sound of his boots echoed unnaturally. At the bottom, he found himself in a massive underground chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding jars filled with what looked like objects. Upon closer inspection, he realized they weren't objects at all. They were human eyes, hundreds of them, preserved in some kind of viscous fluid. Each one seemed to follow his movements, their gaze piercing even in their lifelessness. The floor was littered with belongings, watches, wallets, shoes, all worn and aged. Riley's stomach churned. These were relics of the people who had vanished. He tried to leave, but the cellar door slammed shut above him. His flashlight flickered, and the chamber began to hum softly, like a low vibration. Riley froze. The jars on the shelves started to rattle, their contents bubbling as if alive. Suddenly, a voice boomed, not a whisper, but a deafening guttural roar that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The jars began to shatter one by one, releasing the eyes, which floated mid-air. They coalesced into a swirling mass of disembodied orbs, all staring directly at Riley. Panicking, Riley sprinted for the staircase, but the steps stretched endlessly, as if mocking his escape attempt. The walls began to shift, revealing more shelves and more jars. He was surrounded by endless rows of eyes, all staring, accusing. In his desperation, Riley dropped his flashlight. The room was plunged into darkness except for a faint, pulsating glow from the jars. The glow grew brighter, illuminating a figure at the far end of the chamber. A towering, faceless being with a body made entirely of writhing, blinking eyes. Riley's screams echoed in the chamber as the figure approached, its presence suffocating. He stumbled backward, tripping over a pile of belongings. His hand landed on a rusty knife, and without thinking, he lashed out at the entity. The knife struck nothing but air, passing through the figure as if it were an illusion. The eyes on the figure all blinked in unison, and Riley felt his vision dimming. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. His world went black. The next morning, the villagers found Riley's car abandoned near Garrison House. No one dared enter. Weeks later, a hiker stumbled upon a wallet in the woods, soaked from the rain. Inside was Riley's ID, and a single note scrawled in trembling handwriting. "Don't open the cellar. They see everything." The Garrison House remains untouched to this day, the cellar door still ajar, waiting for its next visitor. In the quiet suburbs of Massachusetts, in 1909, 981, a young woman named Sarah moved into a charming old house, inherited from her late aunt. The neighborhood was peaceful. And the home, though dated, exuded a cozy warmth. Sarah was thrilled to start afresh after a rough divorce, but her excitement soon turned into a nightmare. It began subtly. At night, Sarah often felt as if someone was watching her. She shrugged it off as paranoia from living alone for the first time. But then, she noticed odd things. Her kitchen cabinets would be open in the morning. Despite her closing them before bed, lights she swore she'd turned off flickered back on. Still, she attributed these to forgetfulness or faulty wiring. One evening, as she relaxed with a book in her living room, she glanced out the window. Across the street, a man stood beneath a street lamp, staring directly at her house. He was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. She froze, but when she blinked, he was gone. A week later, Sarah awoke to a faint scratching sound coming from the attic. Gathering her courage, she climbed up with a flashlight. Dust floated in the air as she scanned the space. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. The next morning, she found footprints on the dusty attic floor, large footprints that didn't belong to her. She called the police, but they found no evidence of a break-in. They assured her the house was secure and suggested the footprints might have been from movers or previous tenants. Determined to prove she wasn't imagining things, Sarah bought a Polaroid camera to document any strange occurrences. One night, after hearing faint shuffling noises, she took several photos of the dark hallway leading to her bedroom. When the images developed, her blood ran cold. In one photo, a faint figure could be seen peering from the corner of her bedroom doorframe. It was blurry but unmistakably human. The police came again but found no one. They dismissed it as a trick of the light or a damaged film. Sarah knew better. Terrified, Sarah decided to stay with a friend while she had the locks changed. While moving her belongings, she discovered something chilling, a small hidden door behind a wardrobe in her bedroom. The door led to a crawl space connecting to the attic. Inside, she found old food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and a collection of Polaroids. Each photo was of her, taken while she was sleeping, reading, or simply sitting in her home. The police investigated and confirmed the horrifying truth. Someone had been living in her house, sneaking out only when she was away or asleep. The man was never caught, but locals began sharing stories of sightings, shadowy figures in windows, strange noises at night. Years later, Sarah learned that her aunt, the previous owner of the house, had died under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors whispered that a drifter had been seen lurking around the property back then, but nothing was ever proven. It was a stormy evening when James received the letter. He sat by the fire reading the day's newspaper when a loud knock echoed through his front door. He opened it to find a thick, old envelope lying on the doorstep, no return address or name on it. Inside was a single, chilling line of text. Come to Blackthorn Manor. Find the truth before it's too late. James had heard of Blackthorn Manor, a massive, decaying mansion at the edge of town. Everyone knew the place was cursed, empty for decades, with rumors of strange happenings and a tragic history. The manor had been the home of the Blackthorn family, but after the mysterious death of its last heir, Lucinda Blackthorn, it was abandoned. Some said the house was alive, watching, waiting for the next soul to wander in. James didn't believe in ghosts, but the letter intrigued him. He knew the stories, but as a local journalist, he was always looking for a good story. Maybe there was something to uncover, a forgotten truth behind the rumors. James knew he couldn't go alone, so he reached out to two of his close friends, Sarah and Mark, both of whom had an interest in local history and mysteries. They agreed to join him, though Sarah was reluctant. This isn't a simple abandoned house, James, she warned. People have disappeared. I don't think it's worth the risk. Mark, more adventurous, was the first to agree. Come on, it'll be an adventure. Besides, we'll stick together. Nothing will happen. But even Mark, usually fearless, couldn't hide the tension in his voice when they made plans to visit that very night. They agreed to meet at James' place, and from there they would drive to Blackthorn Manor. As they drove through the winding, empty roads, the atmosphere grew heavier. The trees that lined the way seemed to close in, their branches swaying unnaturally in the wind, casting long shadows across the road. The mansion loomed in the distance, barely visible in the fog that had settled like a blanket. "Just get us there safely, James," Sarah said, her voice tense. "I don't know about this." James didn't respond. He could feel the weight of the silence around them, the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. They arrived at Blackthorn Manor, the towering structure casting a long shadow over the surrounding landscape. The mansion stood as if it were alive, its dark windows staring down at them like eyes. "This is where it all ends," Mark joked, but his nervous laugh didn't hide his unease. The group stood at the front door, which creaked loudly as James pushed it open. A blast of cold air hit them as they entered, and the smell of decay filled their noses. The air was thick, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. The front hall was dark, with only the dim light from their flashlights cutting through the gloom. "All right, let's make this quick," Sarah muttered, her eyes darting around. "We're just here for answers, right?" James nodded, but something about the house felt wrong, unnervingly wrong. The wooden floorboards groaned under their feet, the air colder than it should be. Shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of their eyes, and every creak and groan of the house made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "Let's split up," James suggested, trying to sound confident. "We'll cover more ground this way." "I don't like this idea," Sarah said immediately, her voice sharp. "I really don't." Mark, already moving forward, waved her off. "It'll be fine. I'll stick with Sarah. You go upstairs." James made his way up the grand staircase, the banister cold beneath his fingers. As he reached the top, he heard a soft whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. "Leave now," it said, the sound faint but distinct. He paused, his breath catching in his chest. "What was that?" he muttered to himself, turning quickly to look around. But there was nothing. The house felt like it was closing in on him. The silence grew heavier with each step he took, the weight of something unseen pressing against him. He turned the corner into a long, dark hallway lined with faded portraits of the Blackthorn family. Their eyes followed him as he walked, and the feeling of being watched intensified. "Just the house settling," James whispered, trying to calm himself. But the whisper came again, louder this time, echoing through the hallway. "Go back. It's too late." At the same moment, upstairs, James heard a door slam behind him. He turned around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The whispers were louder now, echoing in his ears. "You shouldn't have come, James. You are part of us now." The air turned ice cold, and James felt the walls closing in on him. His flashlight flickered and went out. He reached for his phone, but it was dead. Panic began to set in. He sprinted down the hallway, but every direction seemed to lead him back to the same spot, like the house itself was shifting. Down in the basement, Mark and Sarah were frozen in terror, staring at the face in the mirror. The glass began to distort, and a hand, pale and bony, reached out from the surface. "Get out now!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping them in the basement. The house was alive, and it was not going to let them leave. The next morning, the police arrived to investigate the missing persons report. They found the front door wide open, the house silent. Inside, the rooms were empty, except for a single broken mirror in the basement. James, Sarah, and Mark were never found. The house still stands, waiting for its next visitors. The people of the village know better than to approach it. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear faint whispers, warning anyone who dares to listen. The house is watching. The curse is alive, and it will claim whoever steps inside. It was New Year's Eve, 1979, in a small town in Eastern Europe. The snow had already begun to settle thickly on the ground, blanketing the streets in a silence that felt almost unnatural. The crisp, cold air carried the distant sound of laughter and celebration from the nearby homes. But there was one house, on the outskirts of town, where no one dared to celebrate. It was a large, decaying mansion that had stood for over a century, known locally for its dark history. The locals spoke of strange happenings within its walls, disappearances, eerie noises, and flickering lights at odd hours. But no one had ever dared to investigate, at least not after what happened 2 decades ago. The mansion had once been home to a wealthy family, the Drevniks, who had lived in that house for generations. They were known for their lavish parties and extravagant lifestyle. But one cold New Year's Eve in 1957, something went horribly wrong. The night began like any other. The Drevnik family, including the patriarch Viktor, his wife Helena, and their 2 children, Alexander and Ivana, were hosting a grand celebration. The house was filled with guests, laughter echoing through the corridors and the clinking of glasses as champagne flowed freely. It was a night of joy, or so it seemed. As the clock struck midnight, Victor raised his glass for a toast, but his voice was drowned out by a loud bang from the attic. The entire house fell silent, a cold wave of unease spreading across the room. At first, they thought it was a door slamming in the wind, but the sound came again, louder this time. A low, guttural sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. Victor, concerned, excused himself and made his way toward the attic. He opened the door, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet as he climbed the narrow stairs. His breath quickened with every step, his heart pounding. The attic was dark, save for a small candle flickering in the corner. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows. A woman, dressed in tattered black clothing, her face obscured by long, wet hair. Victor froze. The woman didn't move. She simply stared at him, her eyes hollow and lifeless. "Who are you?" Victor demanded, his voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she let out a low, mournful wail that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Victor, terrified, backed away, but as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him. The mansion seemed to come alive with strange noises. The walls groaned, the windows rattled, and the temperature dropped sharply. Helena, frantic, rushed up to the attic with a few of the guests, but when they reached the top of the stairs, they found nothing. No woman, no sign of Victor, only the dim candle flickering in the corner, casting long shadows against the walls. The guests searched the entire house that night, but Victor was never found. As the years passed, the Drevnik family was never the same. Helena fell into a deep depression, the children grew distant, and the mansion slowly decayed. Local legends grew around the disappearance, and rumors spread that Victor's spirit had been claimed by the mansion. But it wasn't just Victor who was lost. The mansion itself seemed cursed, as though it had become a vessel for something far darker. In 1979, nearly 2 decades later, a group of thrill-seeking college students decided to spend their New Year's Eve in the old Drevnik mansion. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were skeptical. Just old tales meant to scare children. They arrived just before midnight, laughing and joking as they entered the decaying building. They didn't think anything was wrong at first. The house seemed empty, eerily silent, except for the faint hum of the wind rattling the windows. But as the clock struck midnight, things began to change. The temperature dropped, the air grew thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. Then they heard it, a soft whispering, as though someone was calling their names from deep within the house. They turned, expecting to see one of their friends playing a prank, but no one was there. They laughed it off, chalking it up to the wind or an old house settling. But the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The floorboards creaked under unseen footsteps. And then they saw her. In the dim light of their flashlights, they saw a figure in the hallway, dressed in black, her hair hanging in front of her face. She was walking toward them, her eyes empty and lifeless, her mouth moving but no sound coming from it. Panic set in. The group bolted for the door, but as they reached the front entrance, it slammed shut. They were trapped. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all pleading for help. The walls began to close in on them, the air thick with dread. One by one, they disappeared. Some were found the next morning, wandering the grounds in a state of shock, unable to remember what had happened. Others were never seen again. The mansion remained silent, as though it had swallowed them whole. In the aftermath, it was discovered that the mansion's previous owners, the Drevniks, had all died under mysterious circumstances. Helena was found in her bedroom, frozen in terror, her eyes wide open. Alexander and Ivana had both disappeared, their bodies never found. Victor's disappearance was never explained, but it was said that his spirit still roamed the mansion, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter. To this day, the Drevnik mansion stands as a monument to the past, a place where time seems to stand still, and the horrors of that New Year's Eve continue to haunt the land. Those who have dared to visit it report strange occurrences, unexplained noises, cold spots, and glimpses of shadowy figures moving in the corners of their vision. The mansion is no longer just a building. It is a place where the past and present collide, and where the spirits of the lost are forever trapped. And as for the college students, some say they still hear their whispers on the wind, calling out to those who come too close, warning them of the curse that has claimed so many before. On New Year's Eve, the mansion is alive, and the darkness inside is waiting.